Robert Grayson arrived at his childhood home in Willow Creek with his daughter Sophie, carrying his military duffel bag. His elderly neighbor Dorothy Jones called out from her fence and said he was holding the bag like it still had ammunition in it, and that it was okay to drop the weight because she had promised his father she would tell him that if he ever came back. Robert was shocked because he had never told anyone in this town about his military service, and his father had been dead for 3 years. So how did this old woman know so much about him? Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. Robert Grayson was 34 years old and had just finished 12 years as an Army Ranger. He was tired of war and wanted to be a proper father to his 7-year-old daughter Sophie. Her mother Jennifer had left him 2 years ago because she couldn't handle being a military wife anymore. Robert inherited his father's house in Willow Creek when his father died 3 years ago, but had been overseas and couldn't come back for the funeral. Now he was finally home. The house on Maple Street was old and needed repairs. The paint was peeling and the lawn was full of weeds. Robert stood in the driveway holding Sophie's hand and his duffel bag. He was a tall, muscular man with short brown hair and tired eyes. He had seen too many bad things in the Army and done things he wished he could forget. Sophie asked if this was their new home. Robert told her yes. This was where he grew up. She was a quiet child with brown hair and ponytails and serious eyes that looked too old for a 7-year-old. Then Dorothy Jones called out from the fence next door. She was an elderly woman in her 70s with white hair and sharp blue eyes. She wore a flower print dress and gardening gloves. She told Robert he was holding his bag like it still had ammunition in it, and that it was okay to drop the weight. Then she said she had promised his father she would tell him that if he ever made it back. Robert was confused and startled. He didn't know this woman, and his father had never mentioned anyone named Dorothy. Also, how did she know he had been in the military? He hadn't told anyone in Willow Creek about his Army service. Dorothy introduced herself and said she had lived next door for 40 years. She said she knew Robert's father very well, and that he had been very proud of Robert, even though he worried constantly. She said Robert's father used to sit on the porch watching the road, hoping Robert would come home safe. Robert felt emotional hearing this because he had never thought about his father waiting and worrying. He had been too busy trying to survive each mission. Dorothy said Robert looked just like his father with the same stubborn jaw and the same way of carrying the world on his shoulders. Dorothy met Sophie and invited her to come over for cookies on Sunday. Sophie was excited about this. Dorothy told Robert that if he needed anything, she was right there and that his father would want her to look after him. Robert thanked her but said they would be fine. Dorothy gave him a look that said she didn't believe him, but she went back to her gardening. Robert and Sophie went inside the house. It was dusty and smelled old. Furniture was covered with white sheets. Family pictures hung on the walls. Robert saw a photo of himself as an awkward teenager, standing with his father in front of the same house. His mother had died when he was 10, so it had just been him and his father after that. Sophie said the house was spooky. Robert said it was just old, and they would clean it up. They spent the next hour opening windows and wiping down surfaces. Robert found his old bedroom upstairs with his teenage posters still on the walls. Sophie picked the yellow bedroom across the hall. By evening, they had made the basic rooms livable. Robert ordered pizza because the kitchen wasn't ready. They ate on the floor of the living room. Sophie suddenly asked if Robert missed her mother. Robert said sometimes, and asked if Sophie missed her too. Sophie said yes, but she was glad to be with Robert. They hugged. After Sophie went to bed, Robert went into his father's old study. There was a big wooden desk, a bookshelf, and a filing cabinet. Robert sat in his father's chair and started going through the desk drawers looking for important papers. In the bottom drawer, he found an envelope with his name on it in his father's handwriting. It was sealed. Robert opened it and found a letter. His father wrote that if Robert was reading this, it meant he was dead and Robert had come home. His father said the house was Robert's now, and he hoped it would give him peace. Then his father said there were things he had never told Robert about his past. During the Cold War, his father had worked with people doing secret things. One person in particular had helped their family through dark times. His father called this person a silent partner who made sure the family had what they needed. The letter said if anything seemed strange about the house or the town, Robert should trust this person because they had been watching over Robert his whole life. The letter ended with his father saying he loved Robert and was proud of who he became. Robert was shocked. His father had been a high school history teacher. He had never mentioned anything about Cold War intelligence work or secret operations. Who was this silent partner who had been watching over Robert his whole life? Robert immediately thought of Dorothy Jones. She knew about his military service, somehow. She knew his father very well. She had made a promise to his father. Was Dorothy the silent partner from the letter? Robert was too tired to think about it more that night. He decided he would ask questions tomorrow. But as he went upstairs to bed, he felt uneasy. Coming home to Willow Creek was going to be more complicated than he thought. The next morning, Robert woke up to the smell of coffee. Sophie had figured out how to use the coffee maker and made him coffee. It was too strong, but Robert drank it anyway and thanked her. After breakfast, Robert decided to walk around the neighborhood. Willow Creek was a small town with about 5,000 people. Main Street had the same stores Robert remembered: a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a small grocery store. He walked past his old high school and the park where he used to play basketball. Everything looked the same but felt distant, like an old, faded photograph. When Robert got back to Maple Street, he saw a man in an expensive suit talking to Mr. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down. Mr. Henderson looked upset and was shaking his head. Robert walked over and asked if everything was okay. Mr. Henderson was in his 60s, retired, with gray hair. He had been friends with Robert's father. He introduced a man in the suit as Silas Vane, a property developer who was trying to buy his house. Vane was in his 40s, tall and thin with slick back hair and cold eyes. Vane said he was helping to revitalize the neighborhood by buying properties, renovating them, and bringing in new families. He said it was good for everyone. Mr. Henderson said firmly that he wasn't selling, and had already told Vane this 5 times. Vane smiled and said everyone had a price. It was just a matter of finding it. Mr. Henderson got angry and told Vane to leave his property. Vane stayed calm and said he would be in touch. Then he looked at Robert and asked if he was a new owner of the Grayson house. Robert said yes. Vane said he would like to make Robert an offer too. Robert said he wasn't interested. Vane gave him a business card anyway and set a call if he changed his mind. After Vane left, Mr. Henderson was very upset. He told Robert that Vane had been harassing people on the street for 3 months. So far, Vane had bought 4 houses, and the families who lived there had moved away. Mr. Henderson said the offer seemed generous at first, but then strange things started happening to people who refused to sell. His mailbox had been knocked over twice. Someone spray-painted his fence. His car got a flat tire from a nail that appeared in his driveway. Robert said that sounded like intimidation tactics. Mr. Henderson agreed, but said the police couldn't prove anything. Robert told Mr. Henderson to let him know if anything else happened. Over the next week, Robert and Sophie settled into their new life. Sophie started at the local elementary school and seemed to be adjusting well. Robert started fixing up the house. He repaired the porch steps, painted the outside walls, and mowed the lawn. Physical work felt good after years of military operations. Dorothy came over several times with food and advice. She brought soup casseroles and fresh bread. She told Robert which contractors were honest and which ones would overcharge him. She seemed to know everything about everyone in town. Robert tried to ask her about his father, but Dorothy always changed the subject or gave vague answers. Then on Sunday, Sophie went next door for cookies like Dorothy had promised. Robert used the time to go through more of his father's papers in the study. He found old tax returns, school records, and family photos. At the bottom of the filing cabinet, he found a metal lockbox. It was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom of the drawer. Inside the lockbox, Robert found legal documents, deeds, titles, and property records. He started reading through them, and his blood went cold. According to these documents, Dorothy Jones was the actual owner of the house Robert was living in. The deed was in her name, dated from 30 years ago. Robert's father was listed as a tenant, not an owner. The property had been purchased by Dorothy using a trust fund, and his father had lived there under some kind of arrangement. Robert didn't understand. His father had always said he owned this house. He had left it to Robert in his will as his property. Robert grabbed the documents and walked next door. He knocked on Dorothy's door harder than he meant to. Dorothy opened it with a smile, but her smile faded when she saw Robert's face. Sophie was in the kitchen eating chocolate chip cookies. Robert asked Sophie to go back to their house for a few minutes because he needed to talk to Dorothy. Sophie looked worried but obeyed. After she left, Robert held up the documents and asked Dorothy what they meant. Dorothy sighed deeply. She told Robert to sit down because this was going to take a while. They sat in her living room, which was filled with old furniture and black and white photographs on the walls. Dorothy said she had been waiting for Robert to find those documents. She said it was time to tell him the truth about his father and about her. She asked if Robert's father had ever told him what he did during the Cold War. Robert said his father was a teacher. Dorothy shook her head and said that was only his cover. Robert's father had worked for American intelligence from 1965 to 1985. He wasn't a spy exactly, but he was what they called an asset handler. He managed information networks and dealt with sensitive data that came from behind the Iron Curtain. It was dangerous work, and his father made enemies. Dorothy said she had been his father's handler. She was the intelligence officer who ran his operations and kept him safe. They worked together for 20 years. During that time, Robert's father came across information that certain people wanted to bury. Information about illegal weapons deals and money laundering that involved high-ranking officials. Robert's father refused to let the information disappear. He kept evidence hidden as insurance. This made him a target. Dorothy said there were people who would have killed him to get that information back. So Dorothy did something unusual. She bought the house on Maple Street using a secret trust fund and let Robert's father live there as a tenant. This way, if anyone looked into his assets, they wouldn't find the property. It was a safe house hidden in plain sight. Dorothy said she moved in next door to watch over him. She retired from active intelligence work and became his guardian. She protected Robert's father for decades, and after he died, she continued to protect Robert and his family because she had promised his father she would. Robert couldn't believe what he was hearing. His quiet, boring father had been involved in Cold War espionage. Dorothy had been a spy. Robert asked why his father never told him any of this. Dorothy said his father wanted to protect Robert. He wanted his son to have a normal life, free from the shadows and the fear. He never wanted Robert to be dragged into his old world. Dorothy said Robert's father had been proud when Robert joined the army, but he was also terrified that somehow his past would catch up and hurt his son. Robert asked if that's why Dorothy knew about his military service. Dorothy smiled sadly and said she had been watching over Robert his entire life. She knew when he joined the Rangers. She knew about his deployments. She knew about his divorce. She had been the silent partner his father mentioned in the letter. Robert felt overwhelmed. His whole understanding of his family history had just been turned upside down. He asked Dorothy what his father had been hiding that was so important. Dorothy said it was classified information about weapons deals from the 1980s, encrypted data stored on what they called a black box. She said Robert's father had hidden it somewhere extremely safe, but he never told her exactly where before he died. Dorothy said she thought the information was probably outdated now, and the people involved were likely dead or retired. She said Robert didn't need to worry about it. Robert asked if that's why Silas Vane was buying up properties on the street. Was Vane looking for the black box? Dorothy's face changed. She looked worried. She said she didn't know who Silas Vane was working for, but yes, it was possible someone had finally figured out where Robert's father had lived and was searching for the hidden data. Robert asked why Dorothy hadn't told him this immediately. Dorothy said she wasn't sure until now. Vane could have just been a normal developer, but the aggressive tactics and the focus on the specific street made her suspicious. She said she had been doing some research on Vane's company, and she hadn't liked what she found. Robert asked what she had found. Dorothy said Vane's development company was owned by a larger private equity firm, and that firm was registered in the Cayman Islands, which made it nearly impossible to trace the real owners. Someone with a lot of money and a lot to hide was behind Vane's operation. Robert felt anger building in his chest. Someone was threatening his neighbors and his daughter's safety to find some old classified data. He asked Dorothy what they should do. Dorothy said they needed to find the black box before Vane did, and then they needed to destroy it so no one would have a reason to come after them anymore. Robert asked if Dorothy knew where to start looking. Dorothy said the most logical place would be somewhere in Robert's house, probably hidden in the structure itself. She suggested they start searching. Robert went back home and told Sophie to stay upstairs while he and Dorothy worked on something in the basement. Sophie asked what they were doing. Robert said they were looking for something his grandfather had hidden a long time ago. Sophie asked if it was like a treasure hunt. Robert said yes, exactly like that. Robert and Dorothy spent the next several hours searching the basement. They looked behind walls, under floorboards, and in the ceiling. They found nothing. Dorothy said Robert's father was clever and would have hidden it somewhere even she couldn't easily find. As they were taking a break, Robert heard Sophie scream upstairs. He ran up to find her standing at the front window. She pointed outside. Someone had spray-painted "Sell" or else on Robert's front lawn in big red letters. Robert's military training kicked in. He told Sophie to step back from the window. He went outside and looked around carefully. The paint was still wet. Whoever did this had been here just minutes ago. Robert checked the street, but saw no one suspicious. Mr. Henderson came out of his house and saw the graffiti. He said this was exactly the kind of thing that had been happening to him. Robert called the police. A deputy sheriff arrived 30 minutes later. His name was Deputy Collins, a young man in his 20s who looked nervous. He took photos of graffiti and wrote a report. He said he would talk to Silas Vane, but without proof, there wasn't much he could do. Robert asked if other people on the street had reported similar incidents. Collins said yes, but again, no proof connected them to Vane. After the deputy left, Dorothy came over and stood with Robert on the lawn. She said this confirmed her suspicions. Vane was escalating. They needed to find the black box quickly. Robert agreed. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his father's letter and Dorothy's revelation. His father had lived a double life for decades. Dorothy had been protecting Robert's family for years without him knowing. And now someone was threatening them for information from a war that ended before Robert was born. Robert got out of bed and went back down to the study. He looked at the room with new eyes. Where would his father hide something so important? It had to be somewhere secure, but also somewhere that wouldn't be found by accident. Robert remembered something from his childhood. His father used to spend a lot of time in this study, with the door locked. Young Robert had always thought his father was just grading papers or reading. But what if he had been doing something else? Robert started examining the bookshelf. He pulled out books and checked behind them. Nothing. He checked the desk again, this time looking for hidden compartments. Nothing. Then he looked at the floor. The study had hardwood floors with an area rug in the center. Robert pulled back the rug. The floorboards looked normal, but when he pressed on them, one board in the corner felt slightly loose. Robert got a screwdriver and carefully pried up the board. Underneath was a hollow space. Inside the hollow space was a metal box about the size of a shoebox. It was covered in dust and had a combination lock on it. Robert carefully lifted it out. His heart was pounding. This had to be the black box. Robert tried to open it, but didn't know the combination. He carried the box downstairs and was about to call Dorothy when he noticed something. There were 4 numbers scratched faintly on the bottom of the box. 0427. April 27th, Robert's birthday. Robert tried the combination, and the lock clicked open. Inside the box was a small hard drive, old-fashioned by today's standards, but probably cutting-edge in the 1980s. There was also a folded piece of paper. Robert opened the paper and read his father's handwriting. This drive contains evidence of illegal arms sales to sanctioned countries between 1982 and 1984. Multiple high-ranking officials were involved. I kept this to protect myself and my family. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Destroy this data. Don't let it hurt you like it hurt me. I love you, Robert. Robert sat there holding the hard drive. This little device had shaped his entire life without him knowing it. His father's secrecy, his fear, his need for Dorothy's protection, all because of this. Robert heard a noise outside. He looked out the window and saw a car parked across the street with its lights off. Someone was watching his house. Robert felt his old combat instincts activate. He grabbed his phone and called Dorothy. He told her he had found the black box and that someone was watching his house right now. Dorothy told him not to panic. She would come over to the backyards, so whoever was watching wouldn't see her. She told Robert to turn off the lights and stay away from windows. 5 minutes later, Dorothy came in through the back door. She was carrying a small bag. Robert showed her the hard drive and his father's note. Dorothy read the note and nodded. She said they needed to destroy the drive tonight before Vane, or whoever he worked for, made their move. Dorothy opened her bag and pulled out a hammer. She said the simplest way to destroy a hard drive was to physically smash it. But Robert stopped her. He said if someone was watching the house and they were willing to escalate to threats and vandalism, they might be willing to break in. Robert wanted to know who was behind this. He wanted to know who had turned his father's life into decades of fear. Dorothy looked at him carefully. She said that was the soldier in him talking, the part that wanted to complete the mission and neutralize the enemy. She warned him that this wasn't a military operation. These were powerful people with resources and connections. Going after them could put Sophie in danger. Robert knew Dorothy was right. His priority had to be Sophie's safety. But he was tired of running from ghosts. His whole life had been shaped by secrets and lies. He wanted the truth, even if it was dangerous. Robert told Dorothy he had an idea. If Vane wanted the hard drive badly enough, maybe they could use it as bait. They could draw whoever was really behind this operation and expose them. Dorothy said that was risky. Robert said everything was risky now. They made a plan. Tomorrow Robert would contact Silas Vane and tell him he had found something interesting in his father's house. He would suggest a meeting. If Vane took the bait, they would find out who he was really working for. Dorothy would use her old intelligence contacts to research Vane's financial backers and try to identify the real power behind the operation. Dorothy went home through the backyards again. Robert checked on Sophie, who was sleeping peacefully. Then he sat by the window, watching the car across the street. Around 3 a.m. it finally drove away. Robert wrote down the license plate number. The next morning, Robert called a number on Silas Vane's business card. Vane answered on the second ring. Robert said he had reconsidered Vane's offer and wanted to discuss selling the house. Vane sounded pleased. He suggested they meet that afternoon at a coffee shop on Main Street. Robert agreed. After he hung up, he told Sophie they were going to stay with Dorothy for a few hours later. Sophie asked why. Robert said he had a business meeting and wanted to make sure she was safe. Sophie seemed to accept this. At 2 p.m., Robert walked to the coffee shop. Vane was already there, sitting at a corner table. He was drinking espresso and looking at his phone. Robert sat down across from him. Vane smiled and said he was happy Robert had changed his mind. He asked what had prompted the reconsideration. Robert said he had been going through his father's things and realized maintaining the house was going to be more expensive than he thought. It made sense to sell. Vane nodded and started discussing price. He offered Robert $400,000 for property, which was well above market value for Willow Creek. Robert pretended to consider it. Then he said there was one complication. While going through his father's papers, Robert had found something unusual. Some old classified documents, and a data storage device from the 1980s. Vane's expression changed. His friendly smile disappeared. He asked Robert what kind of data storage device. Robert said it looked like an old hard drive with encrypted information. He said he didn't know what was on it, but it seemed important. He wondered if Vane might know what to do with it. Vane was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if Robert still had this device. Robert said yes. It was locked in his safe at home. Vane asked if Robert had tried to access the data. Robert lied and said no, he didn't have the technical knowledge. Vane leaned forward. He said he might know someone who would be interested in purchasing the device along with the house. He asked if Robert would be willing to include it in the sale. Robert said sure, if the price was right. Vane made a phone call right there at the table. He spoke quietly to someone, giving them updates about the device. Robert couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he saw Vane's face change. Vane looked excited, almost hungry. After the call, Vane told Robert he had talked to his financial backer. They were very interested in the device. They were willing to pay $1 million for the house and the data drive together. Robert pretended to be shocked by the amount. Inside, he was analyzing Vane's reaction. Someone was willing to pay a fortune for that old information, which meant it was still valuable and still dangerous. Robert said he needed time to think about such a big decision. Vane got aggressive. He said the offer was time-sensitive, good for the day only. If Robert waited, the price would go down. Robert held his ground and said he needed at least 24 hours. Vane wasn't happy, but agreed to wait until tomorrow at noon. Robert left the coffee shop and walked back home. Dorothy was waiting for him with Sophie. After Sophie went upstairs to play, Robert told Dorothy about the meeting. Dorothy said the $1 million offer confirmed her worst fears. The information on that drive was still explosive enough that someone was willing to pay anything to get it or destroy it. Dorothy said she had used her contacts to dig into Vane's financial backers. The private equity firm that owned Vane's company had multiple shell corporations, but Dorothy had finally traced them back to a name, Thorne Strategic Holdings. Robert felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Thorne, Colonel Elias Thorne, his former commanding officer, the man who had led Robert's unit in Afghanistan, the man who had supposedly died in an ambush 3 years ago. Dorothy saw Robert's reaction and asked what was wrong. Robert told her about Colonel Thorne. Thorne had been Robert's mentor in the Rangers. He had taught Robert everything about tactics and leadership. But 3 years ago during a mission in Kandahar, their unit was ambushed. Half the team was killed. Thorne was listed as killed in action. Robert had survived but had nightmares about that day. Now Dorothy was saying Thorne owned the company trying to buy Robert's house, which meant Thorne was alive. Robert said that was impossible. He had seen the after-action reports. Thorne's body was never recovered, but he was declared dead. Dorothy said clearly the reports were wrong or falsified. She asked if there was any connection between Thorne and Robert's father. Robert said not that he knew of. His father died before Robert joined the army. Dorothy looked thoughtful. She said this changed everything. If Thorne was alive and had faked his death, it meant he had gone rogue. She said there had to be a connection to Robert's father's data that they were missing. Robert suddenly remembered something. During that ambush in Kandahar, Thorne had been acting strange. He had ordered the unit to investigate an abandoned compound that wasn't part of their mission. When Robert questioned the orders, Thorne had overruled him. They walked into the compound, and the ambush was sprung. At the time, Robert thought it was just bad intelligence. But what if it wasn't? What if Thorne had led them into a trap intentionally? Robert shared this with Dorothy. She said it was possible Thorne needed to disappear and use the ambush as cover. She asked why Thorne would need to fake his death. Robert didn't know, but he intended to find out. Dorothy said they needed to be very careful. If Thorne had the resources to fake his death and run a private equity firm, he was extremely dangerous. Robert agreed, but he also knew they couldn't just hand over the data. Whatever was on that drive had already cost Robert's father decades of fear and had gotten soldiers killed. It had to end. They decided on a new plan. Robert would agree to meet Vane tomorrow and bring the hard drive, but it would be a trap. Dorothy would contact some of her old intelligence community friends and have them ready to move in when Thorne revealed himself. They would expose him and hand over everything to the authorities. It was risky, but Robert was done hiding. His father had spent his life in shadows. Robert refused to do the same. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. That night, Robert didn't sleep at all. He sat in his father's study with a hard drive, thinking about Colonel Thorne. Thorne had been like a second father to Robert in the military. He had been tough but fair, demanding but supportive. Robert had trusted him completely. The idea that Thorne had betrayed that trust, had maybe even orchestrated the deaths of their own men, made Robert feel sick. Dorothy came over early the next morning. She said her contacts had confirmed that Thorne was alive and living under a false identity in the Cayman Islands. He ran multiple businesses through shell companies, mostly private security and military contracting. He was wealthy and well-connected. Dorothy also discovered something disturbing. One of the arms deals mentioned in Robert's father's data involved a Colonel Elias Thorne who was stationed in West Germany in 1983. It had to be the same man. Thorne had been involved in illegal weapons sales over 40 years ago, probably as a young officer. Robert's father had evidence of Thorne's crimes. That's why Thorne wanted the hard drive so badly. It was evidence that could still destroy him, even after all these years. It could prove he had been a traitor to his country for decades. Robert asked Dorothy why Thorne would risk exposing himself by coming after the drive now. Dorothy said probably because Robert's father had recently died. As long as Robert's father was alive, he was a threat to release the information if Thorne came after him. But once he died, Thorne must have thought the evidence would be lost or forgotten. When Robert inherited the house and moved in, Thorne panicked and sent Vane to retrieve the drive before Robert found it. The timing also explained Thorne's fake death 3 years ago. If Thorne knew Robert's father was getting old and sick, he might have planned his disappearance, so he could freely search the evidence once Robert's father died. Robert realized that Thorne had probably been tracking his career the whole time. When Robert became a ranger and ended up in Thorne's unit, it wasn't coincidence. Thorne had arranged it. He wanted to keep Robert close and monitor him. And when Robert's father died, Thorne saw an opportunity to tie up loose ends permanently. The ambush wasn't just about faking Thorne's death. It was also about eliminating Robert, the son of the man who could destroy him. If Robert had died in that ambush, there would be no one left who could find the evidence. But Robert survived, which complicated Thorne's plans. Dorothy said Robert was probably right about all of this. Thorne was tying up loose ends now. Robert asked what they should do. Dorothy said they had to assume Thorne wouldn't come himself to the meeting. He would send Vane or other proxies. But they could use the meeting to gather evidence and make Thorne expose himself. At 11 a.m., Robert's phone rang. It was Silas Vane. He said plans had changed. Instead of meeting at the coffee shop, Robert should bring the hard drive to a warehouse on the edge of town at noon. Vane gave him the address. Robert said that wasn't what they agreed to. Vane said it was this or no deal. Robert hung up and told Dorothy about the location change. Dorothy said it was a trap. Warehouses on the edge of town were isolated, no witnesses. Thorne was probably planning to take the drive and kill Robert. Dorothy said Robert shouldn't go, but Robert had already made up his mind. He told Dorothy to call her contacts and have them ready to move. He would wear a wire so they could hear everything. He would go to the warehouse, but he wouldn't go alone. Dorothy tried to argue, but Robert cut her off. He said this ended today one way or another. Dorothy made phone calls while Robert prepared. He found an old recording device in his father's study and taped it under his shirt. He also took his service pistol from his duffel bag and checked that it was loaded. He hadn't carried it since leaving the military, but today was different. At 11:45 a.m., Robert told Sophie he had to run an errand and she should stay with Dorothy. Sophie looked scared. She asked if Robert was going to be okay. Robert knelt down and hugged her. He promised he would come back. He told her he loved her more than anything. Dorothy walked Robert to his truck. She handed him a small device and said it was a GPS tracker that would broadcast his location to her contacts. If anything went wrong, they would know where to find him. Robert thanked her. As Robert drove to the warehouse, he thought about his father. His father had lived with the fear of Thorne and people like him for decades. He had hidden the truth to protect Robert. Now, Robert was going to finish what his father started. The warehouse was an old industrial building surrounded by empty lots. Robert saw Silas Vane's car parked outside. There was also a black SUV with tinted windows. Robert parked and got out. He had the hard drive in his jacket pocket. Vane was standing by the warehouse entrance. He smiled when he saw Robert, but it didn't reach his eyes. He asked if Robert had brought the drive. Robert patted his pocket and said yes. Vane told him to come inside. The warehouse was mostly empty, except for some old equipment and crates. In the center of the space stood a man Robert recognized immediately, even though he looked different. Colonel Elias Thorne. Thorne was older than Robert remembered, with gray in his hair and new lines on his face. But it was definitely him. He wore an expensive suit and had the same commanding presence Robert remembered from the military. "Hello, Robert," Thorne said calmly. "It's been a long time." Robert felt rage building in his chest. "You're supposed to be dead." Thorne smiled. "Dead to my old life. Yes, I had to make certain sacrifices to start fresh. I'm sorry about the men we lost in Kandahar. That wasn't personal." "Wasn't personal?" Robert said. "You led us into an ambush. You got our brothers killed so you could fake your death." Thorne didn't deny it. He said sometimes individual sacrifices were necessary for the greater mission. He said Robert should understand that as a ranger. Robert said Thorne was a traitor and a murderer. Thorne said Robert didn't understand the complexities of the situation. He said the arms deals from the 1980s were sanctioned at the highest levels of government. He was following orders. But when political winds change, people like Robert's father wanted to expose everything and make heroes of themselves. Thorne said Robert's father was going to destroy careers and destabilize international relationships just to satisfy his conscience. So Thorne and others made sure the evidence stayed buried. They thought they had succeeded. But then Thorne learned that Robert's father had kept a backup drive hidden away. Robert asked how Thorne found out. Thorne said he had people watching Robert's father for years. When the old man died, Thorne knew the evidence was still somewhere in that house. He had bought up the properties on the street to search systematically. But Robert's unexpected return had complicated things. Thorne said he'd hoped to do this quietly and let Robert live in peace. But Robert just had to go digging through his father's past. Now Thorne had to clean up the mess personally. Robert said Thorne wasn't getting the drive. Thorne sighed and said he had hoped Robert would be reasonable. He nodded to two men who emerged from behind some crates. They were big guys in tactical gear, probably private military contractors. Thorne said one way or another, he was leaving with that drive. He would prefer to just pay Robert for it. But if Robert wanted to do this the hard way, that could be arranged. Robert looked at the two contractors. He was a skilled fighter, but 2 against 1 with Thorne watching was bad odds. Then Robert heard Dorothy's voice behind him. "Actually, I think it's 3 against 3. Robert turned and saw Dorothy standing in the warehouse doorway. She wasn't alone. She had brought 2 men with her, both in their 60s but clearly ex-military. They had weapons drawn. Dorothy said her name was Agent Dorothy Jones, retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency. She said she had been recording this entire conversation and transmitting it to multiple government agencies. She told Thorne he was under arrest for murder, treason, and conspiracy. Thorne laughed. He said Dorothy was bluffing. She didn't have the authority to arrest anyone anymore. Dorothy agreed she didn't have official authority, but she had friends who did, and they were on their way right now. She suggested Thorne surrender peacefully. Thorne's face changed. He realized Dorothy wasn't bluffing. He pulled out a gun and pointed it at Robert. He said he wasn't going to prison. He would kill everyone here and disappear again if he had to. But Thorne had made a mistake. He assumed Robert was the same soldier who had followed orders without question. Robert had spent the last 3 years learning to think for himself, to protect what mattered, and what mattered most was Sophie. Robert moved faster than Thorne expected. He dove sideways as Thorne fired. The bullet missed. Robert pulled his own pistol and fired back. His shot hit Thorne in the shoulder. Thorne dropped his gun and fell to the ground. The 2 contractors tried to react, but Dorothy's people were faster. They disarmed the contractors and forced them to the ground. Within seconds, the situation was contained. Silas Vane tried to run, but Robert tackled him. Vane wasn't a fighter. Robert zip-tied his hands, easily. Police sirens were approaching. Dorothy's friends had indeed called the authorities. Robert knelt next to Thorne, who was bleeding but alive. Thorne looked up at Robert with hate in his eyes. He asked why Robert couldn't just let the past stay buried. Robert said because the past wasn't buried. It was right there in Willow Creek, threatening his daughter and his neighbors. Robert's father had spent his life afraid. Robert refused to do the same. He said Thorne was going to answer for everything, including the soldiers who died in Kandahar. Police cars and federal vehicles pulled up outside the warehouse. Agents in FBI jackets came in and took over the scene. They arrested Thorne, Vane, and the contractors. They took statements from everyone. Dorothy gave them the hard drive and explained what it contained. The FBI agents said they would need to examine it as evidence. They thanked Dorothy and Robert for their cooperation and said there would be more questions later. Robert called Sophie to let her know he was safe. She was crying on the phone. Robert promised to be home soon. As federal agents led Thorne away, Thorne looked back at Robert one last time. Robert felt nothing but pity. Thorne had thrown away everything, his honor, his brothers, his life, to protect secrets that had finally caught up with him anyway. Dorothy put her hand on Robert's shoulder. She said his father would be proud. Robert asked if she really thought so. Dorothy said absolutely. Robert's father had fought these same people for decades and never gave up. Robert had finished the fight. Robert and Dorothy drove back to Maple Street together. Sophie ran out of Dorothy's house and threw herself into Robert's arms. He held her tight and told her everything was okay now. They were safe. The next few days were busy. FBI agents came to Robert's house and took the hard drive away as evidence. They said the information on it was indeed classified and contained details about illegal arms sales from the 1980s, involving multiple military officers and government contractors. Colonel Thorne was being charged with treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and the deaths of the soldiers in Kandahar. Silas Vane cooperated with investigators and gave them information about Thorne's organization. It turned out Thorne had been running illegal operations for decades, using his private military company to do jobs that governments couldn't officially sanction. He had become wealthy and powerful, but paranoid about the evidence Robert's father held. The FBI also confirmed that Thorne had indeed orchestrated the Kandahar ambush. He had fed false intelligence to his own unit to create the trap. 6 soldiers died that day. Thorne would face murder charges for each of them. The people on Maple Street who had been harassed by Vane's company received compensation from the federal government for their troubles. Mr. Henderson got his fence repaired, and his property returned to normal. The 4 families who had already sold their homes were offered a chance to buy them back at the original price. The neighborhood slowly returned to peace. Robert spent time processing everything he had learned. His father's secret life, Dorothy's role as protector, Thorne's betrayal. It was a lot to understand. But gradually Robert started to feel lighter. The weight he had been carrying, his father's secrets, his own trauma from Kandahar, was finally lifting. One week after Thorne's arrest, Dorothy invited Robert and Sophie over for dinner. It was the first normal evening they'd had since Robert arrived in Willow Creek. Dorothy made pot roast and homemade apple pie. Sophie helped her in the kitchen. After dinner, Sophie went to watch TV, and Robert helped Dorothy clean dishes. Dorothy asked how Robert was doing. Robert said he was okay, processing everything. He thanked Dorothy for protecting his family all these years. Dorothy said it was her honor. She said Robert's father had been a good man who made a mistake of getting involved with the wrong people, but he had never betrayed his values. He kept that evidence not for revenge or blackmail, but as insurance to protect his family. Dorothy had respected that. Robert asked Dorothy what she would do now. She said she was retired and planned to stay retired. She would keep baking cookies and tending her garden and watching over the neighborhood. She said it was a good life. Robert realized he had been thinking about his own future. He asked Dorothy if she thought he could build a life here in Willow Creek. She asked what kind of life he wanted. Robert said he wanted to be a good father to Sophie. He wanted to be part of a community. He wanted to stop running from his past and start living in the present. Dorothy smiled and said that sounded like a very good life. She said Willow Creek needed people like Robert, people who had fought for something and understood the cost. She said the town would be lucky to have him. Over the next few weeks, Robert settled into his new normal. He finished the repairs on the house. He joined the local VFW chapter and met other veterans. He volunteered at Sophie's school. He had dinner with neighbors. He started to build friendships. Sophie was thriving. She made friends at school and joined the soccer team. She seemed happier than Robert had seen her in years. She stopped asking about her mother as much. She stopped having nightmares about Robert leaving again. She was becoming a regular kid. One Saturday morning, Robert was working in the yard when Dorothy came over. She had something in her hands. It was a photo album. She said she had pictures of Robert's father from over the years, pictures Robert had never seen. They sat on the porch and went through the album together. There were photos of Robert's father as a young man, serious and intense. Photos of him with Dorothy at what looked like intelligence agency gatherings. Photos of him holding baby Robert, smiling with pride. Dorothy told stories about Robert's father, about his courage during dangerous operations, about his fierce loyalty to his country and his family, about how he used to worry constantly about Robert, but never let it show. Robert felt tears in his eyes. He had never really known his father. The man had kept so much hidden. But looking at these photos and hearing Dorothy's stories, Robert finally understood. His father had made sacrifices to keep Robert safe. He had lived with fear and secrets so Robert could have a normal childhood. Robert asked Dorothy if his father had been happy. Dorothy thought about it and said yes. In his own way, she said Robert's father had loved being a teacher and a parent. He had loved Willow Creek. The secrets were a burden, but he never let them steal his joy completely. Robert realized that was what Dorothy had meant with her first words to him. It's okay to drop the weight. She wasn't just talking about the duffel bag or the military service. She was talking about all the weight Robert carried: grief, guilt, fear, anger, trauma. Robert said he understood now. Dorothy had promised his father she would help Robert let go of the weight. She had fulfilled that promise. That afternoon, Robert took Sophie to the park. They played on the swings and the slide. Sophie laughed and ran around with other kids. Robert sat on a bench and watched. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He thought about Colonel Thorne, sitting in a federal prison awaiting trial. Thorne had spent decades running from his crimes, building walls of money and power to protect himself. But in the end, the truth caught up with him. The weight he refused to drop had crushed him. Robert had made a different choice. He had confronted his past instead of running from it. He had trusted Dorothy and accepted help. He had finished his father's fight not out of revenge, but out of love for Sophie and respect for the truth. The next Sunday, Robert and Sophie went to Dorothy's house for cookies as promised. It became their weekly tradition. Dorothy told them stories, shared wisdom, and made sure they felt loved. Robert started dating a woman named Sarah who worked at the local library. She was kind and patient and understood that Robert needed to take things slow. Sophie liked her. Robert got a job teaching high school history, just like his father had. He found he enjoyed helping young people understand the world and think critically. Some of his students were military kids dealing with deployment stress. Robert understood them in ways other teachers couldn't. 6 months after Thorne's arrest, Robert received a letter from the Department of Defense. It was an official apology for what happened in Kandahar. The ambush had been declassified and investigated. The 6 soldiers who died were posthumously honored. Their families received compensation and recognition. Robert attended a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where the fallen soldiers were memorialized. He met their families and shared stories. It was painful but also healing. These men hadn't died because of Robert's failure or random bad luck. They had died because a traitor betrayed them. Knowing the truth didn't bring them back, but it gave their deaths meaning. 1 year after coming home to Willow Creek, Robert stood in front of his house with Sophie. The house looked completely different now. Fresh paint, new porch, beautiful garden. It looked like a home. Needed to be. Sophie said she was happy too. She said this felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. Robert hugged her and said he agreed. Dorothy came out of her house, carrying a freshly baked pie. She said she thought they should celebrate the anniversary of Robert's return. They all went inside and had pie together. As they ate, Robert looked at Dorothy and Sophie, his chosen family, and he felt grateful. Grateful for his father's sacrifice. Grateful for Dorothy's protection. Grateful for the chance to start over. He had finally dropped the weight. The duffel bag sat empty in his closet now, no longer a symbol of who he used to be, but just an object from his past. Robert was no longer the soldier who couldn't trust anyone. He was no longer the son living in his father's shadow. He was Robert Grayson, father, teacher, neighbor, friend. He was home, and that was enough. This story teaches us that carrying the weight of our past, whether it's trauma, secrets, or unresolved pain, will eventually crush us if we don't find the courage to confront it and let it go. Robert's father spent decades living in fear because of secrets he kept hidden, and Colonel Thorne destroyed his life and others' lives by running from his crimes instead of facing them. The key lesson is that true freedom and peace come not from hiding our burdens or pretending they don't exist, but from trusting others enough to share them, confronting the truth no matter how painful, and choosing to build a life based on honesty and connection rather than isolation and fear. Robert only found happiness when he stopped trying to handle everything alone, accepted Dorothy's help, faced his father's secrets, and chose to be present for his daughter instead of remaining trapped by his past. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person, Dot. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. And here's what I need to know. Do you want part 2?